Good morning. Thanks for coming to this week's press availability for the Alaska Independent Democratic Coalition. I'm Representative Chris Tuck, and I'm joined today from Anchorage, Representative Matt Claman, and from Ketchikan, Representative Dan Ortiz. Coming up this week, actually today, Alaska House Finance Committee is going to be looking at Senate Bill 74, that's a Medicaid reform bill. Public testimony will be from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. tonight. House Finance is also working on House Bill 247. That is the fix to our flawed oil tax credit system. House Bill 247 left resources. We weren't very happy in what shape that bill turned into. We agree with what the governor's proposal was, but unfortunately what came out of resources eliminates $400 million in savings and new revenue. We are looking at next year paying more in oil tax credits that were taken in from our shared oil resources. This simply is not sustainable looking at the current fiscal situation that the state is in. We do support measures in hardening the floor, making sure that the oil companies can't reduce their tax liability below that floor, as we're seeing happening now. And in its current form, House Bill 247 bypasses savings in favor of adding to the budget. We're looking at $600 million each year for those oil tax credits to perpetuate, from here on into the future. And so something needs to happen now. We're also a little bit concerned with the 3 bills that were introduced in the Senate yesterday. Of course, the PERS and TERS and the municipal revenue sharing. That's kicking the burden from the state of Alaska on the local communities and their residents there. And what we're going to see effectively is property taxes and other local taxes, including sales taxes, going up for those communities. And the Senate also shifted responsibilities by taking $100 million unallocated cuts into the budget. Not really saying where it's coming from, and they just picked an arbitrary number. Again, that's irresponsible budgeting. And so this year, smart decisions need to be made. Our coalition is willing, ready, and available and able to make these hard decisions this year. We need to do it so we can protect our economy and ward off any recession in the next coming year. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Representative Matt Claman.
Thanks, Chris. Just a couple of things direction-wise. Important bill going on in the House Judiciary Committee now is the Criminal Justice Reform Bill. That's a really important bill, both in terms of fixing the problem that we've had now in our prisons. Basically, 2 out of 3 offenders within 3 years of the time they're released from prison, they're back in prison, and that's actually a sign that the current system is not working. It's costing a tremendous amount. So with a bill that's focused on both reducing reoffending and also getting more dollars from our criminal justice dollars, and a very important part of that too is actually increasing public safety, because we're actually putting a lot of nonviolent offenders in prison for longer and longer periods of time. So criminal justice reform, really a big issue going on in the House and in the Senate, and it's active in the House Judiciary Committee this week. The other thing, of course, the top of everyone's list is the budget. We really need a responsible action plan for Alaska. I'm hearing it consistently from my constituents. I was back in Anchorage over the Easter weekend. I'm hearing again and again in our constituent surveys from West Anchorage, 65% of the public gave the governor's plan either an A or a B, which is a sign that there really is broad support in my community for the governor's plan. And part of the reason for that support is people see that we can't just do it with cuts alone. We actually have to address revenue. We have to do it this session. And that's why I've been saying repeatedly that we need a responsible action plan for Alaska. So I don't want to go at length now. I know Representative Ortiz has some comments, and then we'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks you folks for being here today. You know, it's really not that complex of an issue. It's pretty straightforward. We in the Alaska legislature have been elected to lead and to provide clarity and certainty to the state of Alaska, particularly on this fiscal issue. The legislature must use its remaining days to follow the governor's lead and to put in place a comprehensive fiscal plan to protect our economy and our future, to create certainty for all facets of Alaska. It is our fundamental duty to fulfill that mission. And so far, we have accomplished what I think are three of the most important parts of putting together that fiscal plan. We have accomplished a significant reduction in our state's budget. When you talk about where we were 3 years ago to where we are now in our state's budget, I think we've gone from about an $8 billion operating budget to a $4.5 billion operating budget. That means some significant cuts. And, we felt those cuts throughout the state of Alaska. In my own region, we felt those cuts. Whether it was the Marine Highway System or our Pioneer Home programs, those cuts were felt. But from as long as a year ago, there's been a consensus that we can't do it with cuts alone. We've got to look at two more parts to the program. First of all, we do have to come to some serious discussion and to some serious consideration of these revenue options that the governor's put forward. Whether it's a potential restructuring of our permanent fund or whether it's some of the other different revenue measures and state income tax, whatever it is, we do need to at least have the discussion, to have the communication on those particular issues. And then finally, of course, I guess it's the third part of what I already mentioned, which possibly would be to restructure the permanent fund dividend program and to restructure how we use those permanent fund income earnings, those earnings reserves, to at least look at it, to discuss it, and to debate that. So that's what hasn't happened, parts 2 and 3 to this point, and we don't have that much time left. But I'm still hopeful. I'm hopeful that there'll be a group kind of acceptance of the fact that those discussions have to be made, and they'll include cooperation, communication, and there'll be some serious consideration of those particular facets of the plan. I'm looking forward to the rest of the session, and thanks for being here today.
And I will open up the questions. If you please state your name and affiliation. Yes.
James Brooks from the Juneau Empire. This one's for Representative Ortiz. You're a former teacher. You come from a community that recently had a lawsuit regarding school funding. What do you think about these bills that have been proposed in Senate Finance about pushing some of the funding obligations for PERS and TERS toward local communities?
Very good question. It's a major concern of mine. I do not think that we are going in the right direction in terms of creating a fiscal plan if we're going to simply pass the burden that the state is feeling onto local communities. What that puts into place is what Representative Tuck already mentioned, the potential for increased property taxes, the potential for increased sales taxes, and if you just look at the $50 increase in the BSA, if we were to go around and replace or add the burden of the PERS contribution and the TERS contribution back to the local communities, that alone will more than wipe out the impact of that $50 increase for education. And so, yeah, that's very much of a concern of mine, and I don't think that's the right direction that the state should take in terms of solving its fiscal issues.
And just as a follow-up, what do you think should be done instead?
Here's the thing. We do need to look at a complete fiscal plan. We do need to follow the governor's direction and to look at revenue options and to look at potential restructuring of the permanent fund as a potential solution to the fiscal plan. And if those types of things happen, if any of those particular plans are put in motion, then that creates the revenue to sustain that BSA amount and to lessen the burden that we potentially could put on local communities, whether it's increased TERS obligations or PERS obligations and things like that.
Yes.
Nat Hers with Alaska Dispatch News. I have another question, but I did kind of just want to follow up on that. I mean, is there a independent Democratic coalition plan to deal with the budget crisis, or do you guys basically just support what the governor does, what the governor proposes?
Well, we do support the governor's plan because we like his approach. His approach is that we're all in this together. It takes a little bit from each one of the industries. Unfortunately, it's a little bit unbalanced, but that's just a starting point. It's really up to us to balance that out. We want to make sure we have a fair and balanced plan that doesn't burden one group of people over another group of people. And just like the fishing industry said, yes, we're willing to do our part, but we don't want to be burdened with it all. And that makes sense.
But I mean, is there, do you guys have your own sort of proposal?
Yeah, the governor's proposal with some tweaks to it. When you look at the mining industry hasn't been looked at in decades as far as the revenue coming in. And unfortunately, under the governor's plan, when he first introduced it, went from $12 million down to $6 million, just because of the price of ores these days. So we got to look at that and make sure it's balanced. When you look at, what like sin taxes, we're looking at alcohol taxes bringing in $40 million. Well, how does that compare to the mining industry only having a $6 million increases versus the fishing industry and everything else? So, but that's the structure. I think I think that's a fair approach, is looking at all industries and all interest groups in determining what our fiscal situation or fiscal future should be.
So thank you. Do you?
If I could just add a bit onto that, to echo Representative Tuck's comments, the governor has put forward a plan, and there's elements of that plan that none of us like. All 60 of us, doesn't like. The governor himself doesn't like it, but it is a plan. And what I think it's important for us in the legislature to do is to make that plan more broad-based, to make it more equitable across the board, and to consider some of the different plans that are out there. Representative Seaton has a plan that, to me, this is just me speaking, not the caucus speaking, it looks like it would be a plan that would perhaps be more equitable and have a more equal impact on the broad base of Alaska overall. So I think we need to give that some serious consideration as a part of the process. So the plan would be then to give serious consideration to Governor Walker's past plan, but also to look at some of these other different things and to see how they might make it a little bit more equitable across the board.
And I think the key with all of the economic analysis on the revenue side is how does it all fit together as a total plan? You'll hear folks talk about the change in terms of the floor for the oil industry and the tax credits. Well, that alone doesn't solve the problem. Budget cuts, that alone doesn't solve the problem. We've got, the governor proposed $100 million in cuts. The House budget had about $208 million in cuts. The Senate budget has more than that. But all of them don't make a significant dent on a $3.8 billion deficit. So you have to have the whole package put together. A perfect example about how does it make sense, motor fuel tax, which the governor has introduced as an 8-cent increase. I had conversations with the trucking industry and other industry groups because even at 16 cents, we're still the lowest gas tax in the country. That's actually a user fee. It's kind of a sales tax that basically says the people who are driving and using the highways are paying some. And they actually said, well, if it went up to where we were 24, 25 cents, not this year, but stepped up over a period of time, because that would ensure that we had funds to keep paying for our highways and keep having the funds to match the state side for the federal state match to keep the highways going strong. That was the kind of thing that industry could manage, and I talked with people in my district, and they're pretty comfortable with the motor fuel tax as well. So again, is the governor's proposal the complete answer? No. Should we look at other alternatives in light of those? Yes, I think we should, but the real picture is not one tax or another tax or oil tax credits alone. It's how does the whole package fit together? And the question I keep asking, is this a responsible plan for Alaska? And if it is, as a total package, then I think we'll support it.
Yes, Becky.
Becky Board, the Associated Press. Luke Hopkins had a confirmation hearing yesterday in Senate Resources, and there were some questions about his qualifications to be on the AIDC board. I'm wondering your thoughts. I mean, do you have any concerns about how qualified the governor's appointees, the new appointees, are to the board, and are you anticipating any big fights on the floor during the confirmation process?
Well, I did not watch Senate Resources yesterday. I know that Luke Hopkins was up. I don't know about his qualifications. I haven't looked at his resume and gone through that, but that's why we have the committee process, is to vet a lot of that stuff out. But I do know that Luke Hopkins has a big heart for the state of Alaska. He's served in many different capacities. He's been interested in a gas pipeline for the state of Alaska for many, many years. Through that, what experiences he picked up along the way, I still need to look at myself. Anytime that you have a new administration coming through, especially if they're not fully aligned with the majorities, there is going to be some contentious debate on the floor. And oftentimes, leadership will look for any holes in a person's resume or any opportunity to be able to not quite give the governor what he wants, or to leverage governor in one way or the other. So I think last year was an indication of what we can expect this year. I hope things are a little bit more polite and a little bit more responsive to the governor's needs.
On the scholarship program, you guys have talked a lot about cuts, but also needing to make investments. Do you see the scholarship program, I guess, as an example of an investment? And what do you think of the proposal that would phase that out?
Well, we need to continue investing in our public education, our education system, especially when you're looking to develop new industries for the state of Alaska. That's one of the best investments that we can make. But it's unfortunate to see people giving up on the performance scholarship and the needs-based scholarship so soon, especially when school districts are getting themselves aligned to get into the engineering, mathematics, arts, what am I missing? Mathematics, engineering, all those, science. So looking at the STEAM portion of our education system, we've all geared in that direction. That's a great vision, and we don't want to kill that vision too soon. And to phase that out, if anything, I think we need to expand it, not phase it out.
It's actually one of the interesting features about that. I was looking on the computer this morning, and that performance scholarship was introduced by Governor Parnell. And he's got a Facebook post today expressing how unhappy he is that a program that he really understands how this is an investment in Alaska and an investment in the future, to see the current majority not only looking to basically kill the program, but I think one of the disappointments is, have we given it long enough time to see if it's working? That's one question, but the other part is this legislation is being introduced with less than 30 days left in the session. And the performance scholarships is something that I think the public has a lot to say about it. And so if this is really an idea that we should be debating, I'm kind of surprised that these major restructurings in terms of how the state does business are getting introduced with less than 30 days when the public really wants us to finish in 90 days.
I think this generally speaks to the lack of vision and creativity that we're seeing from the Senate in this fiscal situation that we're in. And Andrew.
So, Andrew Kitcheman, Alaska Public Radio Network. So, much of the centerpiece of fiscal plans that have been put out have been drawing money from the permanent fund reserves, and the governor's plan would draw $3.3 billion, combining some additional funds into the earnings. Senator McGuire's plan would draw $2 billion a year. Are you concerned? And Senator McGuire's plan is been having hearings in the Senate Finance. Are you concerned that Senator McGuire's bill wouldn't draw enough? And what are your thoughts about the amount of money that should be drawn from permanent fund earnings?
Well, when we look at doing anything with the permanent fund earnings, that's the last thing that we want to look into. We want to look at other revenue options first so we can minimize that, because anything you do with the permanent fund is going to affect the dividends. And when you affect the dividends, you're actually affecting poor people equally as the wealthy who have benefited from the state of Alaska. So that's the last thing we will look at. We want to minimize the impacts of that as much as possible. So revenue from other areas we want to look at first. Anything else? Okay.
Hi, good morning. Liz Rains with KTDA. This question is for Rep. Claman. You're hearing the Criminal Justice Reform Bill, HB 205, in House Judiciary. And, the bill is aimed at reducing the prison population, particularly nonviolent or drug-related crimes.
Right.
There's part of the bill that softens sentences, even in cases where there was somebody killed, something like negligent homicide. Is that a part of the bill that you're comfortable with? Does that need reconsideration? And are you concerned that this bill has become so big that there could be parts of it that affect victims in ways that the legislature can't foresee at this time?
Well, the starting point is that there is a commitment from the commission that made the proposals, and I have a commitment that the top two things I'm looking at is first, public safety, and the second thing is that we're providing adequate support for victims. And what's real interesting is that we engaged 13 different victims' rights groups in the process, in the Criminal Justice Commission, in the recommendations, and we've now heard from those 13 groups. And of the 13 groups, 12 of them support the bill and support the criminal justice reinvestment efforts and the efforts to actually improve public safety. And I think what's interesting when you specifically look at negligent homicide, that already today is in the felony scheme of things, is a Class C felony. It is not the most serious offense, and that's continuing under the criminal justice bill. And that's a perfect example of a case in which it starts out by almost the definition of the crime, that you recognize this was not an intentional act. This was not somebody going and stabbing somebody in the backyard or something just horrible. It's essentially an accidental death, and we really have to focus not only on reaffirming community norms, but we really have to look at people that are involved in those crimes about how are we going to reform their conduct in the future so it never happens again. And so that rehabilitation is critical to looking at those crimes. So yes, specifically in terms of negligent homicide, I'm very comfortable with the recommendations of the Commission and what's included in the bill.
Anybody else?
I guess I just have one follow-up. Tomorrow morning, House Education is going to look at the joint resolution proposing a constitutional amendment that would allow general obligation bonds for student loans. Is that a possibility to replace the performance scholarships if we can't keep those around?
I don't know if that's the plan for that, due to the fact that that was introduced quite a while ago. And it's just basically trying to reduce the obligation that we have for the student loans, trying to get the lowest interest rate that we can. As far as the performance scholarships, yeah, that's a whole different animal. It is through post-secondary education. Both are handled through that, but I think that's a different animal altogether.
Any follow-up questions?
All right. Well, we want to thank you for being here this week. We got just over 20 days to get all these solutions figured out, and we're committed to coming up with solutions and working hard the next 20 days to make it happen. So thank you so much. Have a great week.